happy to be here. Thanks everyone for coming. This is a real pleasure. Thanks too to the Maine Humanities Council, just a group of wonderful people doing really important work throughout the state. And it is thanks to their support that I am participating in this World in Your Library program. I'm just gonna jump right in and start telling you the story of the diseased ship. If you had been standing on Boston's Long Wharf 200 years ago on August 1st, 1819, you would have smelled it long before you saw it. The putrid odor that blew into the harbor that day made the entire city sick to its stomach. Dock workers, well accustomed to unpleasant odors, suddenly found themselves doubled over, wrapped in a sickly embrace, so suffocating they would talk about it for years to come. Even the customs agents sitting in their stately offices were not spared the revolting stench. Merchants, laundresses, candle makers, caulkers, street kids, if you were human and you had a nose, you could not help but stop whatever it was you were doing to scan the horizon for the source of the stench. And then it appeared. The 10 Brothers, the long-awaited tall ship belonging to some of the biggest names in Boston shipping. Humphrey, Lyman, Dodge, and Thorndike. These guys were the sons of New England's wealthiest, most influential merchant traders. And at least one of them, Thorndike Sr., had made part of his fortune in the slave trade. So when this group of trust fund kids had launched their joint venture 11 months earlier, they had expected to reap major profits. And now their ship had finally come in. Only, mortifyingly, it reeked to high heaven. Worst of all, at least from an investor's point of view, there was very little cargo in the hold, only stones in ballast and some rotting bags of coffee. It's a matter of common remark that no ship has arrived in our harbor for many years in so foul a state as the 10 Brothers, attested one witness. It has been stated by people of veracity that the ship was extremely foul, echoed another, so as to be offensive to the senses, even when coming up the harbor. What exactly had happened on board this ship after its crew of Cape Cod men pulled anchor and sailed for Sierra Leone 11 months earlier, on September 1st, 1818. What cargo had the vessel carried from West Africa to the West Indies? And what could have imbued its every timber with a putrescence so revolting that no amount of scrubbing or fumigating could successfully mask the horrific stench? Within days of the ship's return to Boston, following its 11-month voyage, the population's disgust turned to terror as sailors and dock workers and customs officials, having had contact with the ship, turned first red, then a shocking shade of yellow, and started to bleed from every orifice before dying in contorted fits of agony. One 19th century commentator offered an account that might sound eerily familiar to us today, now that we are witnessing the devastating impact of COVID-19 on communities precisely in the greater Boston area. Quote, "There were instances in Boston the last summer where one after another in a family was suffered to sicken and die with scarcely a friend to administer the medicine which was prescribed by the physician. Neighbors were afraid to aid each other, although in reality exposed to the same common danger. And brother was afraid to visit brother. Strangers closed the eyes of the dying and hurried them to the grave as soon as the last breath was drawn." 200 years ago, a collective tragedy played out right here in coastal New England, much like the one we are currently experiencing on a global scale. Only in the summer of 1819, it was not the coronavirus that was wreaking havoc on the population. It was the yellow fever virus. Just as investigators today have been able to trace the source of Boston's 2020 outbreak of COVID-19 to that fateful Biogen conference that turned out to be a super spreader event, in that same way, the source of the yellow fever outbreak that ravaged Boston's waterfront 2 centuries ago was patently obvious to public health officials of the day. In fact, it seems the entire city was unanimous in accusing the 10 brothers of carrying a plague in the place of a cargo. The similarities between these two outbreaks hardly end there. But while a lot of folks have turned to history for answers about how we might handle our present challenges, most have sought to draw lessons from the devastating influenza pandemic of 1918. Why, you may wonder, is no one talking about the epidemic that took place 100 years earlier? Well, that's because it got left out of the history books altogether. As I tell you the story of the disease ship, one I dug up in my hometown and have spent the last couple of years reconstructing, I would like you to ask yourselves a couple of questions. How could a story as big as this one have been omitted from the historical record and entirely forgotten? What does this oversight suggest about the way New England's history was written? And what does it tell us about the way our regional identity was constructed? Finally, why does it matter that we know our history? I hope you'll share your thoughts and responses to these questions during the Q&A following my presentation. And now I just want to confess to you that 4 years ago, I had never heard of the ship 10 Brothers, though its captain and crew all hailed from my hometown of Brewster on Cape Cod, nor did I actually know the first thing about New England's involvement in the slave trade. My training was in literature, not history. But everything changed one day when I decided to take a shortcut through the First Parish Cemetery in my old childhood neighborhood. And I happened upon a white marble headstone where it was inscribed, Benjamin Crosby died in Africa, 1795, at the age of 27. Africa, I thought. What had Crosby been doing there? I myself had spent 6 years on the continent, and though I was cautious not to jump to any conclusions, I felt quite certain that our motivations, Benjamin Crosby's and mine, in going to West Africa were likely worlds apart. Could Crosby have been involved in the slave trade? I wondered. In order to even ask this question, my mind had to really struggle like a fish swimming upstream against the raging flow of subtle and overt messages I had received throughout my childhood about the intrepid seafaring men who had built my town through their courage and grit and their famous Yankee ingenuity. And I'll just point out that this sign that we're looking at was carved by my father. And it sits at the end of the Lower Road Cemetery in Brewster. And if I'm not mistaken, I might not be the only one in the room from Brewster, if that's the Chantel I think it is. So once my mind had made that leap to actually asking this question, I began looking all around me, asking for the first time whether some of these Cape Cod sea captains who we so admire and celebrate could have actually been involved in the slave trade, the most heinous and long-standing crime against humanity of all time. I went to the library, found no books on the Cape Cod shelf or anywhere in the online catalogs about Cape Cod's role in the slave trade or Cape Cod in the West Indies, the Caribbean. I went to the Historical Society. They were able to give me no answers. I did learn that, you know, what they shared was that yes, we had been involved in the West Indies trade, but I encountered quite a lot of outright denial that we could have had any involvement in the slave trade. I went to the town hall, to the historic town vault, And I went through my town's records all the way back to 1700, and I found nothing that talked explicitly about a connection to this trade. And, you know, some people were upset that I was asking these questions. Others thought I was misguided. And some were just indifferent. They kind of shrugged and said, I mean, I guess it shouldn't really surprise us if they were involved in the slave trade. As for me, I felt that this question, once it had entered my mind, was so critical, so important. There was no putting it down again until we had some kind of satisfactory answer. So not finding any definitive answers in the library or elsewhere among the town historians, I went back to the cemetery, and there I found no smoking guns. Again, nothing written on a headstone saying this man participated in the slave trade. But what I did find was evidence of a very heavy traffic between Brewster and Africa, and Brewster and the West Indies in particular. And Cuba, of all the Caribbean islands, was the destination of choice of Brewster men. More men from my hometown died in Havana, Cuba, than died anywhere else in the world aside from Brewster itself. And what I learned, like when I asked myself, why were they traveling to Cuba, is that Cuba had become the center of the illicit slave trade. And during the 19th century, it had, when the Haitian Revolution took place, Cuba became the center of sugar production in the Caribbean. And it attracted, so, after the first decade of the 19th century, an incredible traffic from New England. So that is what New England merchants spent a great deal of their time doing, is this coastal traffic, bringing New England goods down to the West Indies, which were so good at producing sugar, they had to import all of the food needed to fuel the plantations that were entirely run on slave labor. And of course, other New England ships were, I say of course, but I didn't know this just a couple years ago, were involved in supplying these West Indian islands with the human cargo, so with the captive Africans that would run these plantations. So as I continued to ask questions, someone in town clued me into the fact that one very prominent man had sailed to Africa by the name of Elijah Cobb, and just my luck, he had written a memoir. So here he is, the man who literally created my hometown of Brewster by engineering its secession from Harwich in 1803. The house that he built a couple years earlier recently underwent a major restoration and became home to the Brewster Historical Society. From rags to riches, Cobb's story reads like a Horatio Alger novel. You may be familiar with the basic scenario. Boy born into poverty manages to overcome his humble beginnings through grit, wit, courage, and determination. If you add to that list luck, charm, and good looks, you've got Elijah Cobb. This Brewster boy had gone off to sea at the age of 15, and by the time his own son came along, he had amassed a small fortune, and he could shower Elijah Jr. and his other children with every privilege, sparing them the hardship he himself had known. This merchant mariner, he accumulated many honors and titles over the course of his long and impressive career. Between voyages and after retiring from the sea in 1820, Cobb managed to serve Brewster in just about every capacity imaginable. He was town treasurer and town clerk, inspector general, justice of the peace, representative and senator to the Massachusetts legislature. And as a member of the militia, he even climbed to the rank of brigadier general. These achievements are all the more impressive when you consider that at the age of 6, after his father died at sea, Cobb's mother had sent him to live with another family in town where he was forced to do hard labor to earn his keep. In other words, Cobb was indentured. It's entirely possible, by the way, that Elijah Cobb would have been a source of inspiration for the prolific novelist Horatio Alger, whose dime novels for boys could be found in virtually every American household throughout the Gilded Age. The Chelsea-born writer would have been intimately familiar with Cobb's story, actually, and that's because prior to getting his start as a novelist, Alger spent 2 years in Brewster as minister of the First Parish Church, just a few short years after the sea captain's death. And someone so invested in the possibility of rising from humble beginnings to glory would have recognized in Cobb's upward mobility the very stuff of the American dream that Alger helped to articulate. Here in Elijah Cobb was a true self-made man. Cobb was even born on the 4th of July, 8 years before the signing of the Declaration of Independence, as if he were some happy harbinger or precursor that perfectly embodied our national character and aspirations. In Cobb's memoir, he tells us about his first overseas voyage to Suriname, about trading in the West Indies, about his travels between Southern American ports during what he calls his coasting years. And in some ways, you could say that he doesn't hold back. The guy admits to all sorts of illegal and unscrupulous acts that actually made him a favorite among Boston's shipping elite. He smuggles contraband, he cheats the embargo, bribes his way into and out of European ports. He outruns the British Navy. He even manages to get a private meeting with Robespierre at the height of France's reign of terror following the revolution. Anything to secure big returns on his employer's investments. In bragging about these exploits, Cobb comes off as a bit of a rogue, but maybe a charming and likable one. He's actually the sort of character featured in so many Hollywood blockbusters whom we idolize for their pluck and cunning, their willingness to risk anything for the love of the chase. But it's important that we not mistake braggadocio for full disclosure. Cobb's memoir is just as notable for what it does not tell us. There is a significant portion of the sea captain's career that we never learn about, for example, because his narrative breaks off before he can describe his final 8 years sailing the world between 1812 and 1820. In a note that must have accompanied the first printed edition of Cobb's memoir in 1857, his grandson explains that the sea captain's health prevented him from recounting the rest of his overseas adventures. And it's definitely possible that ill health was the main obstacle. After all, he was 75 when he set down the bulk of his memories. But this explanation creates the impression that Cobb grew physically incapable of finishing his memoir. And that is simply not the case. These are letters in the collection at the Brewster Ladies Library written by Cobb to his granddaughters that date to 1845. That is 2 years after he had stopped writing his memoir. So, we might ask, what really caused Cobb to end the story of his seafaring career 8 years early? Well, let's look at what he left out. The disastrous 10 Brothers voyage, the story of how he sailed into Boston's harbor in July of 1819 to complete a triangular journey that had all the characteristics of a slaving voyage. I'll just point out that this item was recently acquired by the Brewster Historical Society. It is a black box. It is a document chest, and it's signed with the initial E, Cobb. They believe that it belonged to the man of the house, Elijah Cobb. And what do you notice about it? It's empty. It's empty. The documents that this chest would have contained on board the various vessels that Cobb sailed, those documents are long gone. The letters, the logbooks, the customs receipts, the ship manifests, none of that survives to this day, which is a bit odd because a man so concerned with his legacy, one might think, would keep precisely that sort of document. So here's the ship. By all accounts, it was big and beautiful and fast. Built in 18, very close to where many of us are, actually. It was built in the town of Sullivan, Maine. When I first came across the ship registry, the mention of Sullivan, I believed that that it was referring to a town in Massachusetts, because of course at the time Maine was part of Massachusetts, but Sullivan is just up the coast from here. And in fact, next week I will be visiting the town after many years spent wanting to make the trip. Here's what we know about the crew of the. Here's what we know about the crew of the 10 brothers. The original captain was a man by the name of Joseph Mayo Jr. He was about 30 at the time of the voyage. You'll note that Elijah Cobb was not initially captain of the ship. He was designated supercargo. That means he was responsible for all trading. So he would have decided what cargo to carry and what cargo they would have been seeking to purchase. All of these names, anyone familiar with Cape Cod will know these are the biggest seafaring names in Brewster, and many of them extend throughout the Cape. All of these men were from the town of Brewster, which is fairly extraordinary. The term motley crew, it comes from shipping. It comes from the maritime trades, where most crews were motley. They were made up of men from far and wide. It's very unusual that a vessel would contain only men from one town. There was a second vessel sailing alongside the 10 brothers. It was the schooner Hope. And here, David Nickerson was the master. He was Elijah Cobb's contemporary. They were about the same age. And we know almost nothing else about this vessel. I know very little because it would seem that a lot of effort was put into actually suppressing information about this vessel, and I'll get back to that later. One thing I do know is that Isaac Clarke was on board. This man was Elijah Cobb's best friend. In fact, when I said that Elijah Cobb created the town of Brewster, he did so alongside Isaac Clarke. It was in Clarke's home, in fact, that those papers of secession were signed. Clarke had retired at this point in 1818 when Cobb came along, just back from his from his first African voyage that we know of. Cobb came back. He went to see his friend. He said, "Clarke, come with me. I just made so much money. You stand to gain a tremendous amount." Clarke was then running the town of Brewster. He had retired from the sea. He was very comfortably installed in a beautiful home. So we have to imagine that the inducements, the incentives to come were very powerfully articulated by Cobb. So another thing that I do know about this vessel is that the owners of the Hope were all from Brewster. There is an important connection between Elijah Cobb and David Nickerson, so connecting these two vessels that sailed in consort, and that is a third vessel, the Monsoon. Both Cobb and Nickerson had previously commanded this ship. And that's important because the Monsoon was a slaving vessel. It was a documented slaving vessel. This is a record from slavevoyages.org, which is a very comprehensive database. It is by no means exhaustive, however. It contains records on all of the known slaving voyages. That is, vessels that were caught by the British Navy at the, when it finally got heavily involved in attempting to suppress the slave trade. But as my friend and colleague Kate McMahon will tell you, she is working specifically on Maine's role in the illicit slave trade, and she has discovered that there are a tremendous amount of voyages and vessels that were involved that have not been documented in slave voyages. This one was, however, the Monsoon. And so we know that this ship, that both Nickerson and Cobb had dealings with this ship. We do not know whether they were commanding the ship when it was used as a slaving vessel. That we don't know. So September 1st, 1818, the 10 brothers and the Hope leave for the coast of West Africa. They make port in Lomboko in the Gallinas region of Sierra Leone. This is important because here the slave trade was the #1 business, and US ships sailing the US flag were protected. So it's important to note, okay, we're in 1818, right? That's 10 years after the slave trade was banned by Britain, and then the US following Britain's lead. So if this were a slaving voyage, it would be an illegal voyage. And so we do have this false notion that as soon as the ban was passed, slave trading came to an end. It did not. It continued, as I mentioned just a minute ago, with respect to Kate McMahon's research. And so one of the strategies that was used is, after the trade was banned, the American flag actually became a real hot commodity, because if you were sailing under the flag, you could not be searched by the British. This area was known as the white man's grave. It was very deadly due to mainly the prevalence of yellow fever, but also malaria. But many mariners considered that the risk, was worth it. That's how lucrative the slave trade was, in fact. You see these long boats that are sailing captives out to the tall ships further out in the harbor. Those were often circled with sharks. I say often, in accounts of the period, the description is that there were constantly sharks just circling, because captives would either fall out of these boats, or they would jump out to their deaths rather than board the tall ships. So that to say, it wasn't only white, European and American mariners who were dying in great numbers in this place. This was for the African captives. known as a capital of cruelty and a place of mass death. The slave fort at Lomboko is actually where the captives who were on board the Amistad ship were taken, if you're familiar with the Amistad. So whether or not Cobb and his crew were actually trading in slaves, doing any business here where slave trading was the absolutely bar none, the primary business, they would have witnessed these horrors and they would have been complicit in these horrors. So the ship continues on, sails down the west coast of Africa, and they're doing trade. They spend a long time sort of trading down the coast. And here one might wonder, well, what sort of trade were they doing? Cobb had claimed that his earlier voyage to Africa, he was looking to buy ivory and gold dust, and that is what he reported when he arrived back. So one might wonder, well, could this have been a legitimate trading venture? Maybe they were there to buy gold dust and ivory. So there isn't a lot of scholarship on this question, but there is one book that is a bit outdated at this point, but the author, Brooks, says that yes, there was some legitimate trade in the 19th century with Africa that did not involve slaves. However, that was during a different time period. It took place later, and geographically, legitimate trade was apparently centered more on Senegal, the Senegal region, which is at the bulge there, the westernmost point of the continent, not down what was referred to as the Slave Coast or the Gold Coast. This is Ghana's Elmina slave castle then and now. If you are interested in the question of the slave trade, I recommend a recent series that Samuel L. Jackson just produced with the folks from Diving with a Purpose. You can find it on Epix. They go to this castle, slave castle at Elmina, and a number of other important slave trading forts. They are diving to investigate slave wrecks, so the wrecks of slave ships. After spending some time in Ghana, the two vessels depart for Principe, and they arrive there just at the turn of the year. This is known as a tropical paradise. It actually, a couple years ago, made the New York Times list of 52 places in the world to visit. The men on this voyage referred to Principe as Prince's Island, and together with Sao Tome, it now forms an island nation. At the time, it was Portuguese holding, later colony, and these are the vestiges that you can still see today of Portuguese plantations. They were coffee and sugar plantations. So why would anyone sail to Principe? Well, you could buy coffee and you could buy sugar, but what most mariners were sailing there to do was to purchase enslaved Africans. And that Principe was a place they liked to do that precisely because it was far from the coast, and the coast again was known as the white man's grave. There was these islands had the benefit of having less sickness. So you didn't get yellow fever as easily as when you were doing trade along the coast of Ghana, for example. So this is a notice from the ship news column. When the 10 brothers arrived back in Boston, Elijah Cobb declared that the cargo he was carrying was ivory and coffee. So we have to spend a minute here, a couple minutes, actually asking what cargo, what commodity they would have been trading in. You know what? Can I just stop? Oh, it's 6:45. Are we okay? Okay. All right. Keep going. And flag me down if it's getting to be too long. Okay. And we'll just all right. So here he says that the commodities that he has purchased in West Africa are ivory and coffee. But as I told you, he arrived mostly stones in ballast. There was some ivory on board and there was some coffee, but not, in a commercial volume. Okay. It was what they refer to as an adventure. It was a small amount. Certainly did not fill up the hold. So, and you'll note that here the ship is arriving in Boston from West Africa. Here it's written Princess Island, but Principe, via Saint Pierre's. That is Saint-Pierre in Martinique in the West Indies. So from this, we know that the ship actually made a triangular voyage, typical of a slaving voyage. So here are Cobb and his men at Principe, and they're buying something. Are they buying ivory at Principe? No. That this is not a place where one would buy ivory. Are they buying coffee? Well, quite possibly. Cobb, in a letter that is appended to the end of his memoir, a letter to his wife, mentions that he says, honey, don't worry, I'm going to be a few months late. I am in the harbor at Principe and I'm waiting for the coffee harvest. So that's what he tells his wife. However, when the ship arrives back in Boston and the officials come on board to inspect, and they just see a fairly insignificant amount of coffee, they start questioning Cobb. Because what they're trying to figure out, what commodity Cobb bought in Principe and sold in Martinique, right? Would you sell ivory in Martinique? Like, why would you go to Martinique after Africa? Not to sell ivory, definitely not, okay? Again, it's sugar plantations end to end, and maybe these planters have pianos, but they're certainly not, not in a great quantity. Would you buy coffee in Principe and bring it to Martinique to sell? No, because in Martinique, they grow their own coffee, right? So what commodity was purchased, in Principe that was then sold in Martinique? That is the big mystery. And as the investigators are looking through the vessel after it arrives back in Boston, they find some ears of corn stuffed up in the timbers. And they say this putrid corn. And they ask Cobb, what is this all about? And he says, that is what I purchased in Principe, Indian corn. So if we are to believe that, that means that Cobb sailed all the way to West Africa, to the white man's grave, risked, you know, his life and those of his crew to buy a commodity that is native to New England. Indian corn, which he could have purchased right here and sailed safely down the coast, as I showed you earlier, that long-standing trade route from New England to the West Indies, could have sold it. It would have taken a whole lot less time, would have been a lot less expensive, and a lot less dangerous. So Indian corn, for a savvy businessman like Elijah Cobb, that would have been the absolute worst idea ever. Highly unlikely that he sailed to West Africa to buy corn, right? Why was corn on board? Well, I will just note that Indian corn was one of the primary grains used to feed the captive Africans on board slaving vessels. It was ground up into a sort of a flour and made into a gruel, just to keep them alive through the Middle Passage. The ships are there in the harbor at Principe, and suddenly men on board both the Hope and the 10 Brothers begin to drop like flies. They knew they were being mauled by mosquitoes, but they just didn't know that the mosquitoes were the source of the illness that was taking them down one after the other. It was yellow fever. They did know that because these longtime savvy mariners knew yellow fever when they saw it. It has very distinct characteristics, which I explained to you, at the outset. So on February 7th, the boy Kimball dies. 4 days later, Isaac Clark, Cobb's best friend, the man who had been in retirement, he dies. 7 days later, the captain of the 10 Brothers, Joseph Mayo Jr., dies. Captain Nickerson of the Hope, he becomes very ill, and Cobb, at this point, he appoints John Dillingham, a 19-year-old kid. He appoints him captain of the Hope, and he says, sail back, sail on. Take Captain Nickerson with you. And that's what he does. So the ships, they part ways. Cobb takes control of the 10 Brothers. He is, after all, the senior member of the crew, and he's the one who organized this whole voyage. He takes command, and he says, we're going to sail out to sea for a bit, let this bad air pass. But we can't leave completely because there's too much money on the table. He says in a letter to his wife that he's got $3,000 or $4,000 in orders, and he appoints somebody to conduct his business on the island of Principe, and they sail out to let the sickness pass. Well, they're out for about a month before the 10 Brothers sails back to complete its transactions. So what we have to consider is the nature of that choice. When Boston's Board of Health later investigated this whole series of events, they concluded that Cobb's actions in the face of this horror, watching his friends and his crew die before his eyes, that he was not just responsible, he was heroic. So let's consider the choices that Cobb made. On February 20th, after at least 4 men have died, he takes command, sails out, then sails back to Principe in full knowledge of the risk, back to the very port where his men have died. And they don't just make quick work of it. They spend another 2 months between Principe and Sao Tome completing their commercial venture. Now for what? For corn? Did he risk the lives of his crew again to pick up Indian corn? So on May 19th, the 10 brothers departs for Martinique. And there is no account of what happened during that middle passage. But let us take a moment and imagine if it was not, in fact, corn, the primary object of Cobb's commercial transactions in West Africa, but in fact, enslaved Africans. If there were captives on board that vessel in the hold, on this ship that is diseased, where yellow fever is rampant and is being spread by way of mosquitoes, well, just imagine what's happening in the hold of the ship during these 41 days. I contacted Marcus Rediker, who is a leading scholar on the slave trade, and asked him his opinion. Could this have been a slaving voyage, in his opinion, given the evidence that I'd assembled? And he said, yes, quite possibly. And he said that the average slave ship of about 160 tons carried approximately 300 Africans. And he said, yours could have carried as many as 400. So the vessel arrives in Martinique. It's important to note that after the vessel departs, there's an outbreak of yellow fever. And it sails back to Boston. And on the way back to Boston, Cobb's nephew and his namesake dies. But Cobb says that to investigators later that he just died from a cold. Again, you'll remember that the ship, when it arrived in Boston's harbor, was considered the most foul ship to ever, enter the harbor in recent memory. And what it did first was to stop at Quarantine Island because it was required. Quarantine had been established after this horrific episode in our nation's history, the yellow fever epidemic of 1793 that almost destroyed Philadelphia. 5,000 residents died of yellow fever, 20,000 fled. This was at the time the capital of our country. And it was in the wake of this terrible outbreak that boards of health were created, actually, to prevent this sort of thing from happening again. Well, Boston had instituted quarantine regulations. Actually, it was Paul Revere who was the head of the Board of Health in Boston. So all vessels coming from the tropics between May and October were to stop at Quarantine Island. Also, there was a rule about how long vessels should stay there. And here, the fact that Elijah Cobb Crosby died on the way back from Martinique to Boston should have extended the time that the ship stayed at quarantine. But Cobb short-circuited. He evaded the quarantine regulations. He only stayed for a very brief while at Rainsford Island, and very curiously broke a third rule of quarantine, the no visitors rule. I mean, it's pretty obvious, right? Like, the whole idea behind quarantine is separating the healthy from the potentially sick. Well, a vessel brought a number of people onto Rainsford Island and onto the 10 brothers, one of whom was that young man, Dillingham, the 19-year-old who had sailed the Hope back to Boston. Very curious. Why would Dillingham come on board the 10 brothers? Well, he did so just in time to die, actually. He was among the first to die. These numbers that you see are very small, and that is because the authorities did everything in their power to suppress evidence of the impact of this outbreak. We have seen the same play out today. Early in the pandemic, this desire not to, keep the numbers low. We don't, it's not good for business, right? If we show that there's a huge impact, well, Boston was doing everything in its power to downplay the importance of this pandemic because all of its trade was dependent on keeping its port open. And if it announced that yellow fever was afoot, it would have to quarantine. Boston would have to quarantine itself. So there were stories that hundreds, thousands were dying. And it was really the disappearance of the family of Benjamin Wild that a lot of people pointed to as an indication that the authorities were just lying about the numbers. So this entire family died in what clearly they had all the symptoms of yellow fever, but the authorities said that he died of drinking cold water. I don't have time to actually go through all the details of this story, but this is a document that I found in these are the internal records of Boston's Board of Health. And this is a report that was made right at the height of the pandemic, or the outbreak, the epidemic. And you notice that it's carefully redacted. Every single letter has been scratched out, but somebody came up, afterwards and tried to reconstitute part of it. And so that first sentence reads, "The subscriber having heard a communication from Dr. Welsh." Dr. Welsh was the port physician, and he would have been one of the first people in contact with the 10 Brothers vessel as it arrived in Boston. I'm hoping one day to find a forensic specialist who can help recover the rest. This would be a very telling document. But just to sort of give you the skinny on what happened following the arrival of the ship, the authorities could not deny it was the public. The entire population of Boston was pointing to this ship saying, this is the source of the outbreak. There was no denying it. So the Board of Health said, yes, this is a diseased vessel, and we ordered it scuttled and sunk. And they say in their report that the order was immediately carried into effect. Only they had to order it scuttled and sunk a second time. They say this time even though our previous order was adhered to, we ordered again on the 17th, directing the removal of the ship to the opposite side of the channel, and again scuttled and sunk. This order was complied with too, which must have made it really embarrassing when they had to make the order a third time. So here they're saying the ship, yes, ordering it to be removed to quarantine ground, now way out near Hospital Island, and there again scuttled and sunk. All of these orders of the board were faithfully carried into effect. This is sort of the height of absurdity. Like if Kafka got his hands on this, he would have a field day. I have asked numerous experts, maritime historians, is there any way that you could take a three-masted tall ship and scuttle and sink it, and then refloat it, not once, but twice in the space of 11 days? Could you sink a ship and refloat it twice and then sink it a third time for good? And no, I mean, this is, everyone's scratching their head, like no one's heard of this. That would be a true feat of engineering. But what this reveals is that the Board of Health actually was absolutely ineffectual. They didn't have power compared to the wealthy merchant class who owned this vessel. What the Board of Health was doing, they were political appointees, and they were not physicians, and they were not the most powerful men. They simply were trying to enforce rules, but they had no power to do it. So just to wrap up, Cobb was accused of two very serious crimes: contraband slave trading and knowingly bringing the plague to Boston. He was publicly accused of these two crimes. And I know that not because I was able to find the accusation, but I was able to find his rebuttal, his response to these very public accusations, impugning his reputation. His response is sort of a case study in, rhetoric. He goes through all of the, appeals to pity and this and that, like, I had no idea, ignorance, what have you. But then, he finally wraps it up by saying, would I have sailed a diseased vessel into Boston, like, if I knew it was diseased, would I have had my wife and son on board the 10 brothers with me to sail from Rainsford Island into Boston? And here is where I forgot to mention this. Not only was Dillingham brought to Rainsford Island, the captain of the Hope, but in that same clandestine episode, so was Cobb's wife and two of his sons. They were brought on board the 10 brothers just before it sailed into Boston Harbor. So this is the photo op, right? This is like, okay, everyone get on deck. They sail into Boston Harbor. It's the image, right? It's theater. And it seems everything indicates that he did that. He broke the quarantine regulations and had them come on board the vessel so that he could say this, so that he could say, why would I possibly put my own family in jeopardy had I known? So Cobb was exonerated. The Board of Health felt that he did a wonderful job, actually, with everything. In fact, they say, we investigated and it does not appear that the ship was engaged in the slave trade. Everyone was beautiful, really, including themselves. This is now the Board of Health patting themselves on the back, saying, we did a great job, when actually, they failed to prevent the epidemic from breaking out. So there are just, this story hasn't attracted much of any attention. It's largely gone under the radar completely, but a couple of people have been aware that there was this sort of big event. But everyone up until now believed that, the ship was actually sunk. after the Board of Health ordered it scuttled and sunk 3 times. And in fact, what I discovered when I Googled it is that the ship was never sunk. Because so many documents are now available, our digital, we've digitized so many documents, and we've got great records available now to us. I was able to find that a ship log existed at the Phillips Library of the Peabody Essex Museum for the 10 brothers. And when I found this, I thought, this can't possibly be a ship's log for the 10 brothers, my ship, because this one is for a ship sailing in 1820, and my ship was sunk in 1819 after this, scandal. Not so. It's the very same ship. You look at the registry, it's the exact same tonnage, the exact same chain of ownership. So in fact, although the 10 Brothers was sold after the fiasco of arriving in Boston in 1819 with disease on board, still Humphrey, one of the previous owners, remained owner. And it sailed on. The 10 Brothers sailed to Brazil, which was the prime destination for enslaved Africans in the 19th century. So just to put things in perspective, North America, under 500,000 captive Africans were brought to North America throughout the length of the slave trade that we know of. The small island of Cuba, 1 million captive Africans, actually in quite a short period of time when it became the hub of the sugar trade. But Brazil, 5 million captive Africans were brought to Brazil to work in the sugar plantations and the coffee plantations in particular. So it appears that the 10 Brothers sailed on and continued doing what it had been doing, illicit slave trading. The contagion was contained. This was, the other assumption made by those who had looked at this case previously, this notion that this ship was sunk and then that's it, everything, resolved. That prevented an outbreak of disease. Well, not so. The epidemic spread. So New York was hard hit, and again, the numbers cited here, very small, 66 people died. No, many, many more died. But as I said, all authorities had an interest in underreporting their numbers. But you could see all of Lower Manhattan was shut down to commerce. Everyone fled. New York, in response, quarantined Boston, and they pointed directly to the 10 Brothers vessel, and they said, it's because of you that we're experiencing this epidemic now. And the pandemic hit Charleston that summer. So by September 15th, Charleston had reported 105 deaths. We have to imagine that there had been many, many more. And of course, it wouldn't end until the frost came and killed off the mosquitoes that were carrying the virus, which wouldn't happen for a couple months more. Baltimore was hit very hard. Here, the authorities reported over 2,000 deaths. How many actually died, we'll never know, probably. But it was so devastating that the mayor just declared a day of fasting and prayer, because it seemed there was no way to, there was nothing that they could do. Absolute devastation. And actually, this epidemic spread throughout the Atlantic world that year, even as far as Cadiz, Spain. which hadn't known a yellow fever epidemic in decades. But that year, over 5,000 people in that small town of Cadiz died. So what did the Boston Board of Health do? They shrugged, and they just, concluded their report by saying, well, diseases are heaven's messengers. This was ordained by God, which is just the height of cynicism, right? Because that's what a Board of Health is there to do. They know that there are certain measures, like wearing a mask, that actually work and help prevent disease, but they failed to institute those measures. Meanwhile, Elijah Cobb was able to retire to Brewster comfortably, go back to his home, and all of those prestigious positions that he held in town, those were given to him after this fiasco. So in other words, he didn't come home to shame. Nobody in town held him responsible for the many deaths among Brewster men. 7 Brewster men died on this voyage, which is to say that, I like this story because there is no clear, one cannot say definitively that this was a slaving voyage. There is still room for doubt, right? But I think it's a powerful story because with that room for doubt, every person must decide what they're going to do with it. For the past 200 years, people have been giving Elijah Cobb the benefit of the doubt. He has benefited extraordinarily from that. And that is, perhaps that's what the residents of Brewster did. They just gave him the benefit of the doubt. More likely, they knew that he was slave trading, and they were complicit, and that it was a complicity of silence that grew up around this event and became something we just don't talk about. So that's it. Cobb was buried on his tombstone. It's written, "The end of the upright man is peace." And I think that what is important today, as we're revisiting monuments and what to do with them, and really reviewing our whole history and our approach to doing history, that we just take some moments to think about this story. Like, shall we not stop giving men like Elijah Cobb the benefit of the doubt? Is it not time that we, even if there is doubt, that we invest in our moral imagination in trying to think about the impact of a voyage like this on the African captives he could very well have had in his hold. So thank you. Thanks for your patience. And if anyone has any questions, I'm sorry I went long, but.
That was excellent, excellent, Meadow.
Thank you.
Fabulous. The graphics are unbelievable. It's just, I'm surprised me in the speaking. It's sort of speechless kind of material.